Before I begin, I'd love to know where you're all listening from today, so drop a comment down below. They said I was getting too old, that I couldn't manage on my own. My own son, Mark, and his wife, Susan, even took my house key. For my own good, they claimed, as if I were a child who couldn't be trusted with sharp objects. They whispered about my forgetfulness, about the dangers of me living alone in the house I'd shared with my dear Harold for over 50 years. But they underestimated me, you see. They saw an old woman, a widow, perhaps a little slower than I once was, and they assumed I was finished, a piece of furniture to be managed or moved aside. They thought they could just walk in and take over my life, my home, the sanctuary Harold and I had built with our own hands and hearts. They were so profoundly, devastatingly wrong. This is the story of how they took my key, a small piece of metal that unlocked my front door, and in response, I ended up taking back far more than just the deed to my house. I took back my dignity, my peace, and my life. Stick around, and I'll tell you exactly how I turned their insatiable greed and breathtaking disrespect into their greatest, most public regret, and how I found a strength I thought had faded with the passage of years. My name is Clara, and for 78 years, I've walked this earth. Most of those years were spent loving and caring for my family. My husband, Harold, was the love of my life. We built our home, this very house, from the ground up, not literally with hammers and nails for every single board, but we chose the plans, oversaw the construction, planted the oak tree in the front yard when it was just a sapling. Now it towers over the roof, its leaves whispering secrets to the wind, secrets of our life together. Every corner holds a memory. Harold laughing as he tried to hang wallpaper straight in the dining room, the scuff marks on the kitchen floor from Mark's tricycle when he was a little boy, the scent of roses from the bushes Harold planted for our 25th anniversary that still perfumes the air every June. When Harold passed 3 years ago, a part of me went with him, of course. The silence in the house was a physical presence, heavy and suffocating at first. But slowly, I learned to live with it, to fill it with my own quiet routines. I'd read by the window where the morning sun streamed in, tend to my small herb garden, bake Harold's favorite apple pie, even if it was just for me and my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson. Mark, my only child, and his wife, Susan, lived about an hour away. They'd visit perhaps once a month, sometimes less. Their visits became different after Harold was gone. Less about connection, more about, well, inspection, it felt like. Susan, especially, would run her finger over a dusty shelf with a sigh, or comment on how a leaky faucet, that I was perfectly capable of calling a plumber for, was just too much for me to handle. Mark, bless his heart, used to be such a thoughtful boy, but he'd changed under Susan's influence, or perhaps with age and his own perceived importance. He'd nod along, looking at me with a sort of pity that pricked at my pride. They started talking about my affairs, about making things easier for me. I knew what they were hinting at. This house, a paid-for, 4-bedroom home on a sizable lot in a desirable neighborhood, was, in their eyes, an asset. My asset, but one they increasingly saw as their future. I wasn't a fool. I saw the way Susan's eyes would catalog the antiques Harold and I had collected, the way Mark would casually ask about the property taxes or the insurance. I tried to dismiss it, to tell myself they were just concerned. But a cold knot would tighten in my stomach each time they left, a feeling of being scrutinized, assessed, like a prize cow at a county fair. I had always sacrificed for Mark. His education, his first car, the down payment on his own first house. Harold and I had stretched ourselves, gladly, because he was our son. We believed in giving him the best start. It never occurred to me then that he might one day see me not as his mother, but as a stubborn old woman clinging to something he felt entitled to. The house wasn't just bricks and mortar. It was my life, my history, my independence. It was where Harold's presence still lingered, a comforting warmth in the lonely hours. The thought of leaving it, of being forced out, was like contemplating an amputation of a vital part of my soul. But their suggestions became more frequent, more insistent, veiled in layers of false concern that felt more suffocating than any genuine neglect could have. Little did they know, the quiet woman they saw pottering in her garden was watching, listening, and remembering every single slight. The day they took my key, it started like any other Tuesday. I'd had my tea and toast, read the paper, and was planning to repot some geraniums. Mark and Susan called mid-morning, said they were in the area and wanted to pop by. That itself was unusual. Their visits were usually scheduled well in advance, fitting into their busy social calendar. A little flutter of apprehension went through me, but I told them, "Of course, dear, come on over." When they arrived, Susan was carrying a small, brightly wrapped gift bag, which she handed to me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Just a little something for you, Clara," she said, her voice overly sweet. Mark hovered behind her, looking vaguely uncomfortable, which, in hindsight, should have been a bigger warning sign. I opened the bag. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was one of those digital photo frames. "Oh, it's lovely," I managed, though my heart sank. It felt so impersonal, so corporate. "We thought you'd like it, Mom," Mark said. "We can load it up with pictures of the grandkids." So much easier than all those dusty old albums. I clutched Harold's favorite album, which was on the side table, a little tighter. Then came the real purpose of their visit. After the awkward pleasantries, after Susan had subtly rearranged a cushion on my sofa to make it look better, Mark cleared his throat. "Mom," he began, his tone attempting to be gentle but coming across as condescending, "Susan and I have been a bit worried about you. Rattling around in this big house all by yourself," I bristled. "I'm perfectly fine, Mark." "I'm not rattling," Susan chimed in, smooth as silk. "Of course you are, Clara. But, emergencies can happen. What if you fell and couldn't get to the phone? We'd want to be able to get in quickly to help you." My hand instinctively went to the chain around my neck, the one with my emergency alert button. "I have my pendant, Susan. And Mrs. Henderson has a spare key." As you know, Mark waved a dismissive hand. "Mrs. Henderson is lovely, Mom, but she's not getting any younger herself. And sometimes these pendants don't work, or you might forget to wear it." He paused, then dropped the bombshell. "So we were thinking it would be best if we had a key to the house. Just for emergencies. We could keep it safe." I stared at him, then at Susan, whose expression was one of saintly concern. "My house key." They wanted my key. It felt like they were asking for a piece of my autonomy. I don't think that's necessary," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I'm very careful, and as I said, Mrs. Henderson," Susan interrupted, her voice still syrupy. "Oh, Clara, don't be difficult. It's for your own good. We just want to be able to look after you." Think of the peace of mind it would give us. The arrogance of it, the sheer presumption, took my breath away. They weren't asking, they were telling. Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, padded envelope. "We even brought a spare we had made last time we borrowed it to check on the plumbing when you were visiting Aunt Carol." A lie. I'd never given them my key to borrow like that. They must have taken it and copied it on some pretext, or perhaps during a visit when I wasn't looking. The cold dread intensified. "No," I said, firmer this time. "I'm not comfortable with that. This is my home." Mark's face hardened. The gentle facade slipped. "Mom, we're not asking. We're your family. We need to be able to get in. What if something happens and we're locked out, worrying ourselves sick?" He made it sound like my refusal was an act of cruelty towards them. Susan placed a hand on my arm. "Please, Clara. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I looked from my son's determined face to my daughter-in-law's false solicitude, and a wave of helplessness washed over me. I was tired of arguing, tired of feeling like I had to defend my every decision in my own home. In that moment of weakness, I didn't know how to fight them without causing an enormous scene, one I didn't have the emotional energy for. "Where is your spare key, Mom?" Mark asked, his voice now devoid of any pretense of kindness. I gestured numbly towards a small dish by the door where I kept it. He walked over, picked it up, and slipped it into the envelope. "There. That's settled then," he said, with an air of satisfaction. "We'll keep this very safe. Now, about that digital frame, let's get it set up for you." They stayed for another hour, chattering about things I barely heard, while I sat there, stunned, violated. The key, my key, was gone. Taken. Not given. and with it a huge chunk of my security and peace of mind. When they finally left, Susan kissing the air near my cheek, Mark giving me a perfunctory hug, the silence they left behind was no longer just quiet. It was cold, menacing. I walked to the front door, staring at the lock, feeling as though the very heart of my home had been compromised. That night, I barely slept, the image of Mark pocketing my key replaying in my mind. It wasn't just a key, it was control. And they had taken it. The unease didn't just linger. It grew, festering like an untended wound. In the days that followed, the absence of my spare key in its usual dish was a constant, glaring reminder of my compromised independence. Then the unannounced visits began. The first time, I was in the garden, my hands covered in dirt, when I heard the front door open. My heart leaped into my throat. Had I forgotten to lock it? I rushed inside, muddy boots and all, to find Susan in my hallway, coolly examining a framed photograph of Harold and me on our wedding day. "Oh, there you are, Clara," she said, without a hint of apology for letting herself in. "Mark just wanted me to drop off some paperwork for you to look at. He's thinking of helping you consolidate some of your accounts. Make things simpler." She placed a folder on the hall table, its contents no doubt outlining their plans for my finances. I was too stunned to say much, just mumbled something about her startling me. "Well, that's why we have the key, dear," she replied with a saccharine smile. "So, we don't have to disturb me?" She had walked into my private home as if it were a public thoroughfare. The anger began to bubble beneath the surface of my shock and hurt. They didn't call beforehand. They just appeared. Mark would show up, ostensibly to check the gutters or see if the furnace filter needed changing, tasks I was perfectly capable of managing or hiring someone for. He'd walk through the house, his eyes scanning everything, making mental notes. Susan would often accompany him, and her contributions were usually small, insidious changes. A decorative plate I'd cherished, a gift from Harold from a trip to Italy, was moved from the mantelpiece to a less prominent shelf. "It looked a bit cluttered there, Clara," she'd explain if I even bothered to ask. My favorite armchair was suddenly angled differently. To improve the flow of the room, they were eroding my space, my choices, piece by piece. I started to feel like a ghost in my own life, a reluctant spectator to the gradual takeover of my home. The comments about my capabilities, or lack thereof, also escalated. "Are you sure you should be climbing that little step stool, Mom? Let Mark do it. Perhaps we should arrange for a cleaner to come in, Clara. This house is getting a bit much for you." Each suggestion, wrapped in the guise of care, was a tiny stab at my competence, my independence. I recalled all the years I'd sacrificed for Mark. When he was young, I'd worked part-time, juggling home and job, to ensure he had everything he needed. I'd stayed up late helping him with school projects, cheered him on at every football game, even when his team always lost. Harold and I had dipped into our savings, money we'd carefully put aside for our own retirement, to help him with the down payment on his first house, the one he and Susan now lived in, far grander than anything Harold and I had ever aspired to. We'd done it gladly, out of love. And this was the repayment? To be treated like an incompetent child, to have my home invaded, my wishes disregarded? The bitterness was a constant, acrid taste in my mouth. One Saturday afternoon, I was dozing in my chair, a book open on my lap, when I heard voices from the kitchen. Not just Mark and Susan's, but other, unfamiliar voices too. My heart pounded. I crept to the kitchen door, peering through the slight gap. Mark and Susan were there with another couple, strangers to me, and they were discussing renovations. "Yes, we're thinking of knocking this wall down," Susan was saying, gesturing towards the wall separating the kitchen and dining room. "Open it all up. Much more modern," the strange woman nodded approvingly. "And new countertops, of course. Granite, perhaps?" My dining room, where Harold and I had shared thousands of meals, where we'd celebrated birthdays and anniversaries. My kitchen, where I'd taught Mark to bake cookies. They were discussing its demolition as if I didn't exist, as if the house were already theirs to remodel as they pleased. That was the last straw. The casual, callous discussion of tearing apart my home, my memories, in my own presence but without my involvement, ignited a fire in me that I thought had long been extinguished. The pain of their betrayal was immense, a physical ache in my chest. They didn't just see me as old, they saw me as already gone, a minor inconvenience to be managed until they could claim their inheritance. The realization was sickening. My son, my own flesh and blood, was waiting for me to die, or at least become incapacitated enough for him to take complete control. The hurt was profound, but beneath it, something else began to stir, a cold, hard resolve. They had mistaken my quiet nature for weakness, my grief for senility. They were about to find out how wrong they were. That night, sleep was impossible. The overheard conversation replayed in my mind, each word a fresh insult. But instead of tears, there was a simmering anger, a determination crystallizing in my heart. They wanted my house? They wanted control? Well, they had started a war they were not prepared to fight. The image of Susan gesturing blithely at the wall she intended to demolish, the wall that held the faint pencil marks where Harold had measured Mark's height year after year, burned in my memory. That was it. The absolute, unbreachable limit. The next morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The fog of grief and uncertainty had lifted, replaced by a steely purpose. Harold had always said, "Clara, you're stronger than you think. You've got a backbone of pure steel, even if you keep it hidden most of the time." I'd smiled then, thinking he was just being kind. Now, I felt that steel stiff in my spine. My first thought was Mrs. Henderson, my dear neighbor. She was a practical, no-nonsense woman, widowed herself, and fiercely independent. But as much as I valued her friendship and support, I knew this situation required more than a sympathetic ear. This required legal intervention. I remembered a conversation Harold and I had years ago when we were updating our wills. We'd used a lawyer, a young woman then, sharp and compassionate. Monica Brewster. I found her old business card tucked away in Harold's desk, the very desk Mark had eyed appraisingly on his last visit. I took a deep breath and dialed the number. Her firm was still there, and though she was now a senior partner, she agreed to see me. The journey to her office downtown was a small act of rebellion in itself. I hadn't driven downtown in ages. Mark usually insisted on driving me to any important appointments, another subtle way of controlling my movements. But I navigated the traffic, found a parking spot, and walked into the polished, quiet lobby of the law firm feeling a flicker of my old self returning. Monica remembered me, or at least pretended to with grace. She was older now, of course, her dark hair streaked with distinguished silver, but her eyes were just as keen, her smile just as warm. Her office was elegant but not intimidating, filled with books and a few tasteful pieces of art. It exuded competence. "Clara, it's been a long time," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "What can I do for you?" I started hesitantly, recounting the events of the past few months, my voice trembling at first as I described the taking of the key, the unannounced entries, the casual discussions of renovations. I told her about Susan moving my cherished possessions, about Mark's condescending tone. As I spoke, the narrative of their transgressions flowed more easily, fueled by righteous anger. I explained how they made me feel, like an intruder in my own home, like my feelings and wishes were irrelevant. I detailed the overheard conversation about knocking down walls, the final indignity that had spurred me to action. Monica listened patiently, her expression growing more serious as my story unfolded. She didn't interrupt, just made occasional notes on a legal pad. When I finally finished, a heavy silence filled the room. I felt drained, but also strangely lighter, as if a great burden had been shared. "Clara," Monica said, her voice gentle but firm, "what Mark and Susan are doing is not just disrespectful, it's a form of elder abuse. They are creating a hostile environment for you in your own home, and their actions regarding your property and finances are deeply concerning." Hearing her validate my feelings, to put a name to their behavior, was immensely empowering. I wasn't just being sensitive or difficult, as they tried to make me believe. My indignation was justified. "The house," Monica continued, "is it solely in your name now, since Harold passed?" Yes, I confirmed. We had it as joint tenants with rights of survivorship. Harold made sure everything was straightforward for me. Good, Monica said. That simplifies things considerably. The house is yours, Clara. Entirely yours. They have no legal right to enter without your permission, key or no key. They certainly have no right to make decisions about its structure or your finances without your explicit, informed consent, preferably with legal counsel present for you. She then asked about my will. I explained that Harold and I had made mirror wills years ago, leaving everything to each other, and then to Mark. Has Mark ever seen this will? Or discussed it with you in a way that suggests he feels entitled based on its current terms? I thought back. He's made comments, assumptions, I suppose. That everything will naturally pass to him. Susan too. They talk about when they inherit as if it's a settled fact. A date on the calendar, Monica nodded. We need to review that immediately. And we need to take steps to secure your autonomy and your property. First things first, they have no right to that key. We can send them a formal letter demanding its return and stating they are not to enter your property without your express invitation. But frankly, given their behavior, I'd recommend something more immediate. She leaned forward. Clara, how do you feel about changing the locks? A small gasp escaped me. Changing the locks. It felt like such a definitive, confrontational step. But the thought also sent a thrill of empowerment through me. Can I do that? It's your house, Clara, Monica said with a reassuring smile. You can absolutely do that. And I think you should. As soon as possible, we then discussed my finances, the accounts Susan wanted to consolidate. Monica advised me to ensure Mark had no access or signing authority on any of my accounts unless I specifically, and with full understanding, granted it. We talked about a durable power of attorney. I had signed 1 year ago, naming Mark in case I became incapacitated. We need to revoke that immediately, Monica stated, and appoint someone you trust implicitly, or even a professional fiduciary, if you prefer. Mark has demonstrated he cannot be trusted to act in your best interest. The pieces were falling into place. A plan was forming, a way to fight back. Leaving Monica's office that day, I felt like a general preparing for battle. The fear was still there, a knot in my stomach at the thought of the inevitable confrontation with Mark and Susan, but it was overshadowed by a burgeoning sense of resolve. Harold was right. There was steel in my spine, and it was finally time to use it. The days following my meeting with Monica were filled with a strange mixture of trepidation and exhilarating purpose. It felt like I was moving through a spy novel, my own quiet suburban life transformed into a theater of covert operations. Monica had been wonderfully efficient. She drafted a new durable power of attorney for me to sign, naming her as my agent for financial matters should I become incapacitated, with strict instructions to preserve my estate for my own use, and then for beneficiaries I would explicitly name in a new will. The old one naming Mark was effectively neutered. She also prepared a formal letter to be sent to Mark and Susan, but we decided to hold off on sending it, opting for a more direct, impactful strategy first. Changing the locks. The very next day, I called a locksmith. A nice young man named David arrived, polite and professional. As he worked on the front and back doors, replacing the old cylinders with new ones, I felt a layer of grime being scrubbed off my life. Each turn of his screwdriver was like a tiny victory. When he handed me the new set of keys, 3 shiny, uncompromised keys, I held them in my palm, feeling their weight, their symbolism. These were my keys and mine alone. No copies lurked in Mark's pocket or Susan's purse. That evening, for the first time in weeks, I double-locked my doors with a profound sense of security. The simple click of the deadbolt was the sweetest sound. My next step was the bank. Monica had advised me to review all my accounts and ensure Mark had no access. Years ago, in a moment of practicality after Harold's passing, I'd added Mark as a signatory to my main checking account, just in case. I needed him to pay bills for me if I was unwell. At the time, it seemed sensible. Now, it felt like a gaping vulnerability. I made an appointment with my bank manager, a kind woman named Mrs. Albright, who had known Harold and me for years. I explained as calmly as I could that I needed to restructure my accounts for my own security. I didn't go into all the sordid details with her, just stated that I wanted sole control. Mrs. Albright was understanding and helped me open new accounts in my name only, transferring the balances. The old joint account was closed. I felt a little pang of sadness doing it. It was another severance, another admission of the breakdown of trust with my son, but the relief far outweighed it. While at the bank, I also rented a new safe deposit box. Over the next few days, I carefully gathered important documents. The deed to the house, which Monica had confirmed was solely in my name, clear and unencumbered. My revised will that Monica was drafting, insurance papers, a few pieces of Harold's jewelry that I cherished, and some old family photographs that Susan had shown an unwelcome interest in. I placed them all securely in the box. This was about more than just legal maneuvers. It was about reclaiming my narrative. Mark and Susan had been trying to write me out of my own story, or at least edit me down to a footnote in theirs. I was now taking back the pen. I started feigning a slight increase in my supposed frailty when they called. If Susan asked if I needed anything, I'd sigh and say, "Oh, everything is such an effort these days, dear." If Mark mentioned visiting, I'd sound a little confused. "Oh, are you? That's nice." I needed them to believe I was declining, becoming more dependent, more malleable. It was a distasteful charade, but a necessary one to ensure they wouldn't suspect my quiet rebellion. The hardest part was the deception, the constant vigilance. I, who had always valued honesty, was now engaged in a campaign of strategic misdirection. There were close calls. One afternoon, Susan called, her voice tight. "Clara, I drove by the house earlier, and I saw a locksmith's van in your driveway. Is everything all right?" My heart hammered. I took a slow breath. "Oh, that? Yes, dear." The front door lock was sticking dreadfully. You know how these old houses are. I just had him fix it. "It's fine now." I tried to sound airy, a little dottery. "Sticking? It seemed fine to me last week," she pressed, a hint of suspicion in her tone. "Well, it wasn't fine for me today, Susan," I said, with a touch of manufactured peevishness that I hoped sounded like an old lady being crotchety. Honestly, the things one has to deal with. She didn't push further, but I knew she'd report it to Mark. Let them wonder. Let them think I was just a forgetful old woman dealing with mundane household issues. Monica and I had further conversations about the house itself. She had done a thorough title search, confirming again that it was entirely mine. "Mark may believe he has some future claim through your old will, or he might just be operating on sheer entitlement," Monica explained. "But the current legal reality is that this house is your asset to do with as you please. You can live in it, sell it, leave it to whomever you choose in a new will." We began discussing the terms of that new will. It was a strange process, deciding the fate of my worldly possessions knowing my own son might be excluded. There was a profound sadness in it, a mourning for the relationship I wished I had with Mark. But his actions and Susan's had made this necessary. I wasn't acting out of spite. I was acting out of self-preservation and a deep-seated need for justice. I started thinking about Harold's sister's granddaughter, young Emily, a sweet, hard-working girl studying to be a nurse. She always sent me thoughtful cards on my birthday and, at Christmas, genuine little notes that warmed my heart. Perhaps the planning was meticulous, layer upon layer of protection and reclamation. I was no longer just Clara, the grieving widow. I was Clara, the quiet strategist, the woman taking back her power, one legal document, one changed lock, one secret decision at a time. The anxiety was still a companion, but now it was tinged with a thrilling anticipation of the moment when the curtain would be pulled back, and Mark and Susan would see not the frail old woman they'd tried to manipulate, but a force to be reckoned with. The new locks clicked with such satisfying finality each evening. My home, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, felt truly secure again, a sanctuary defended. Monica had couriered over the final versions of all the documents, the revoked power of attorney for Mark, the new one appointing her, and, most significantly, my newly drafted will. Reading it through, I felt a sense of profound, albeit somber, resolution. My house, my cherished home, was to be left in trust for young Emily, to help with her education and her future. My remaining assets were to be divided between a few specific charities Harold and I had always supported, particularly one that provided aid to elderly people who were isolated or in need, a cause that now felt intensely personal. Mark was mentioned by name, but only to state that I had made other provisions for him during my lifetime and that he was to receive a nominal sum, $1, to demonstrate he had not been accidentally omitted. It was a harsh step, but a necessary one to protect my legacy from his and Susan's avarice. Signing those papers in Monica's presence was a solemn act. It wasn't a moment of triumph, not yet, but one of grim necessity. A weight lifted from my shoulders, replaced by the quiet determination to see this through. I spent the next few days preparing, both practically and emotionally. I rehearsed in my mind what I would say when the inevitable confrontation occurred. I knew they wouldn't take the discovery of the changed locks lying down. Their sense of entitlement was too vast for that. I anticipated their outrage, their accusations, their attempts at emotional blackmail. I needed to be ready, to stand firm, to not allow myself to be swayed by any last-minute appeals or feigned remorse. I also took the time to truly reclaim my space. Susan's subtle, unwelcome adjustments were systematically undone. Harold's and my wedding photo went back to its place of honor in the living room. The Italian decorative plate was restored to the mantelpiece. My favorite armchair was positioned exactly where I liked it, overlooking the garden. I even bought a new, brightly colored rug for the hallway, a small defiance against the muted tones Susan seemed to favor. Each act was a reassertion of my identity, my taste, my ownership. I found myself thinking of Harold a lot during this time. What would he have made of all this? He had always been protective of me, a gentle giant with a strong sense of fairness. I imagined him standing beside me, his hand on my shoulder, nodding his approval. "You show them, Clara." I could almost hear him whisper. "You show them what you're made of." His imagined support bolstered my courage. Monica had advised me to have someone present when Mark and Susan next tried to enter, but I decided against it, at least initially. This was my battle, and I needed to face them myself, at least for the first exchange. Monica was on standby, of course, ready to intervene if things escalated, and I had her direct number programmed into my phone. I even practiced a calming breathing exercise she'd taught me, a way to stay centered if they tried to provoke me. The waiting was the hardest part. Every time the phone rang, my stomach would lurch. Every car that slowed down on our street made me glance out the window. I knew they wouldn't just try the key silently and leave. Their arrogance wouldn't permit such a quiet defeat. They would make a fuss. They would demand an explanation. And I would be ready to give them one. I made sure my little emergency alert pendant was always around my neck, just in case, though I felt more fortified by my resolve than by any electronic device. The house felt like a fortress now, not a prison. The locks were my allies, the newly signed legal documents my armor. I was no longer the victim of their machinations. I was the architect of my own defense, and soon, the agent of their comeuppance. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, sounds that had once seemed to amplify my loneliness, now sounded like the steady, rhythmic pulse of a home that was truly, unequivocally mine once more. I was ready. Let them come. It was a Saturday morning, a week after I'd changed the locks. I was in the kitchen, enjoying a second cup of coffee and reading a novel, the sunlight streaming through the window, painting golden patterns on the floor. There was a sense of normalcy, a peaceful quiet that I was beginning to cherish anew. Then I heard it, a car pulling into my driveway. My heart gave a familiar jump, but this time it was mixed with a surge of adrenaline, not just fear. I peeked through the curtains. Mark's ostentatious SUV. Of course. I watched as he and Susan got out. Susan was carrying a covered casserole dish, no doubt some unwanted culinary offering meant to disguise their true intentions. They walked up the porch steps, chatting, completely oblivious. I saw Mark reach into his pocket and pull out his key, my old key. He inserted it into the lock. Turned it. Nothing. He frowned, jiggled it, tried again. The look of confusion on his face was almost comical. Susan, noticing his struggle, stepped closer. What's wrong? I heard her muffled voice. Mark muttered something, then tried the key with more force. Still nothing. His confusion was rapidly turning into annoyance. He rattled the doorknob. Then he banged on the door. Not a polite knock, but an insistent, demanding thud. I took a deep breath, placed my coffee cup carefully on the counter, and walked to the door. I didn't open it. Instead, I called out, my voice clear and steady. Who is it? Mom? It's us. Open the door. Your key isn't working. Mark's voice was laced with impatience. Oh, Mark, Susan. Hello? I said, still through the closed door. Yes, I know the key isn't working. I've had the locks changed. There was a moment of stunned silence from the other side. Then Susan's shrill voice cut through. Change the locks? Why on earth would you do that without telling us? I didn't feel the need to consult you about the security of my own home, Susan. I replied, my voice calm. I could hear Mark trying to shush her. Then his voice, louder now, attempting a tone of authority. Mom, open this door. We need to talk about this. We can talk perfectly well like this, Mark. Or you can use the doorbell, and if I choose to, I might invite you in. But you will not be letting yourselves in anymore, more sputtering from Susan. Then Mark, his voice tight with anger. Mom, this is ridiculous. We have things for you. Susan made her tuna casserole, as if a tuna casserole could excuse their behavior. That's very thoughtful of her, I said, my tone even. But I'm afraid I won't be needing it today. Perhaps you can enjoy it yourselves. The banging started again, harder this time. Clara, let us in right now. Susan shrieked. This is harassment. I almost laughed. Harassment? After weeks of them invading my privacy? No, Susan, I said, my voice rising slightly to be heard over their thumping. Harassment is entering someone's home uninvited, rearranging their belongings, and planning to demolish their walls without their consent. What I am doing is protecting my property and my peace of mind. I heard Mark swear under his breath. Then a shift in tactics. His voice became wheedling. Mom, please. There's obviously been a misunderstanding. Let's just talk face to face. We're worried about you. I'm perfectly fine, Mark, I stated. In fact, I haven't felt this fine in months. Now, if you'll excuse me, I was in the middle of my coffee. I turned away from the door, my heart pounding, but a fierce satisfaction coursing through me. They continued to bang and call out for a few more minutes, their voices a mixture of outrage and disbelief. I simply ignored them, walking back to the kitchen and picking up my book, though my hands were trembling too much to read. Finally, the banging stopped. I heard their car doors slam, the engine roar to life, and then the sound of tires screeching as they backed out of my driveway far too quickly. Silence descended. A beautiful, victorious silence. A few minutes later, my phone rang. It was Mark. I let it ring for a bit before answering, taking another calming breath. Hello.
Mom.
What in God's name do you think you're doing? He exploded, no pretense of concern now, just raw fury. I'm ensuring my privacy and security, Mark. Something you and Susan seem to have forgotten the meaning of. We had a key for emergencies. For your safety. My safety. I countered, my voice laced with the irony he clearly couldn't grasp. Or for your convenience. For your plans to take over my life and my house piece by piece? You took my key, Mark. You didn't ask, you took it. You violated my trust and my home. You treated me like I was already senile, an obstacle to your ambitions. That's not true, he blustered. We love you. We were just trying to help. Your help felt remarkably like a siege, I said coolly. You and Susan have made it abundantly clear that you see this house, my home, as your future inheritance, and me as the inconvenient occupant. You discussed knocking down walls in my own kitchen, for heaven's sake, without even a word to me. There was a pause. He was clearly flustered. Susan was just brainstorming. It meant nothing. It meant everything, Mark. It showed me exactly where I stand with you. Now, let me be very clear. This house is mine. The deed is in my name, and my name alone. I have taken legal advice, and I have made new arrangements for my entire estate. Arrangements that reflect my wishes. Not your expectations. I could almost hear his jaw drop. What are you talking about? What arrangements? That, Mark, is none of your concern anymore, I said, my voice firm. You and Susan have shown your true colors. You are so focused on what you thought you would get from me that you forgot to treat me with basic human decency, let alone the respect a son should show his mother. But, Mom, the will, he stammered, his anger deflating into panic. My will is my business, Mark, and it has been updated to reflect current realities. You took my house key, believing it gave you entry into my life and my assets. Well, I've taken back the deed, so to speak. I've secured my home, my finances, and my future, independently of you, Susan's voice screeched in the background. She can't do this to us, Mark. Tell her she can't. I smiled faintly. Oh, but I can, Susan. And I have. Now, I have nothing more to say to either of you on this matter. Do not come to my house uninvited again. If you attempt to harass me further, I will not hesitate to involve the authorities. Goodbye, Mark, and with a click, I ended the call. My hand was shaking, but my spirit soared. The first major battle was won. The silence that followed the phone call was profound. It wasn't the empty, lonely silence of before, but a rich, resonant silence filled with the echoes of my own reclaimed power. I sank into my armchair, the one they'd tried to reposition, and let out a long, shaky breath. Relief washed over me in waves, so potent it was almost dizzying. It was done. The immediate confrontation was over. I had stood my ground, spoken my truth, and they had heard it, loud and clear. For a while, I just sat there, letting the adrenaline subside. The house seemed to breathe with me, a calm, steady rhythm. The sunlight felt warmer, the colors in the room brighter. It was as if a suffocating blanket had been lifted. My first conscious thought was of Harold. Oh, how I wished he could have witnessed that. He would have been so proud. Maybe in some way he had. I felt a tear trace a path down my cheek, not a tear of sadness, but one of profound emotional release. It was a tear for the love we'd shared, for the home we'd built, and for the strength I'd found to protect it. After a while, I got up and made myself a fresh cup of coffee. As I sipped it, I walked through the rooms of my house. Each one felt different now. The living room, with Harold's picture back in its rightful place, felt like a testament to enduring love. The kitchen, no longer under threat of Susan's sledgehammer or granite countertops, felt warm and inviting again, a place of nourishment and memory. Even my bedroom, which had started to feel like a place of vulnerability, now felt like a safe haven. The immediate aftermath wasn't entirely peaceful, of course. My phone buzzed a few times with texts from Mark, a mixture of disbelief, anger, and pathetic attempts at manipulation. Mom, you're not thinking clearly. Susan is devastated. You've really hurt her. We need to talk. This is all a terrible mistake. I read them, then deleted them without replying. Monica had advised me to keep a record of any harassment, but these felt more like the desperate flailings of a thwarted child than genuine threats. Later that afternoon, I called Monica to update her. Her voice was warm with approval. Clara, you did wonderfully. You were strong, clear, and you set unambiguous boundaries. I'm proud of you. Thank you, Monica, I said, my voice still a little hoarse. I couldn't have done it without your guidance. What do you think they'll do now? They might try a few more times to appeal to you, to guilt you, or even to threaten you with legal action, though they have no grounds, Monica predicted. But ultimately, they have no power here. You hold all the cards. The best thing you can do is maintain your silence with them for now. Let them absorb the reality of the situation, and that's what I did. There was another attempt a few days later. A florist delivery truck pulled up, and a ridiculously oversized bouquet of funereal-looking lilies arrived, with a card signed, "With deepest regret for any misunderstanding. We love you." Mark and Susan, I accepted the flowers, thanked the delivery man, and then promptly donated them to the local hospice. The gesture was too little, too late, and reeked of insincerity. One evening, Mark even showed up at the door again, alone this time. He rang the bell, looking contrite, almost tearful. Through the peephole, I saw him standing there, shoulders slumped. I didn't answer. After about 10 minutes, he left, looking utterly dejected. It pained me, on some deep, primal level, to see my son like that. But the pain was quickly superseded by the memory of his and Susan's callousness, their greed, their utter disrespect. This wasn't about punishing them, it was about protecting myself. The house slowly settled back into its comfortable rhythms, but they were my rhythms now, undisturbed. I started to sleep soundly through the night, a luxury I hadn't experienced in months. I found myself humming as I worked in the garden. The fear that had been my constant companion began to recede, replaced by a quiet confidence. The world looked different, sharper, more vibrant. I was no longer just waiting, passively, for the next encroachment. I was living. In the weeks and months that followed, a new chapter of my life began to unfold, one characterized by a quiet strength and a renewed sense of purpose. The absence of Mark and Susan's intrusions was like a balm to my weary soul. My home, once a battleground, was now truly my sanctuary again, every corner resonating with peace and my undisputed ownership. I started reconnecting with people I'd unintentionally let drift away during Harold's illness and my subsequent grief, and then during the stressful period with Mark and Susan. I called my old friend Eleanor, who lived across town, and we met for lunch. It was wonderful to laugh again, to talk about books and gardening and current events without a hidden agenda or a critical eye observing my every move. Eleanor, who had known me for decades, remarked, "Clara, you seem different. Lighter. There's a spark back in your eyes." Her words warmed me. It was true. The burden I'd been carrying, the constant vigilance and simmering resentment, had been lifted. I joined a local book club that met at the library, something I'd always wanted to do but never quite found the time or energy for. I even started volunteering one morning a week at the very hospice where I donated Susan's funereal lilies, helping to arrange flowers and chat with the patients. It felt good to give back, to connect with others in a meaningful way. The house itself seemed to flourish under my rediscovered joy. I spent hours in the garden, coaxing new life from the soil. The roses Harold had planted bloomed more profusely than ever that summer, their fragrance a constant, sweet reminder of his love. I rearranged the furniture in the sunroom, creating a perfect reading nook for myself, filled with plants and comfortable cushions. I even painted the small guest bathroom a cheerful yellow, a color Susan would have undoubtedly declared too bright. Each small act of personalization was a quiet celebration of my autonomy. News of Mark and Susan trickled back to me indirectly. Mrs. Henderson, my neighbor, who was discreet but observant, mentioned that she'd heard from a mutual acquaintance that Mark and Susan had put their own overly ambitious expansion plans for their house on hold. Apparently, Mrs. Henderson said, with a slight twinkle in her eye, they were counting on a rather significant windfall that didn't materialize. I merely nodded, offering no comment, but a small, satisfied smile played on my lips. It seemed their financial assumptions had been rather deeply rooted in the prospect of my assets. There was no pleasure in their financial discomfort, not exactly, but there was a certain ironic justice to it. They had been so eager to count their chickens before they hatched, and now their coop was rather bare. Monica and I finalized all the details of my estate. I felt a profound sense of peace knowing that my home and what Harold and I had worked for would go to someone who would appreciate it, to causes we believed in. Young Emily, Harold's grandniece, was overjoyed and tearfully grateful when I subtly hinted that I might be able to help with her nursing school tuition in the future. Her genuine appreciation was a stark contrast to Mark and Susan's grasping entitlement. I reflected often on what I'd learned. I'd learned that age does not equate to obsolescence. I'd learned that even in the face of profound betrayal by those closest to you, it's possible to find an inner wellspring of strength. I'd learned that dignity isn't something that can be taken from you unless you allow it. It can always be reclaimed. And I learned that sometimes the hardest decisions, the ones that involve severing ties that should have been sacred, are the ones that lead to the truest peace. My home was no longer just a collection of bricks and mortar. It was a symbol of my resilience, my victory. It stood as a testament to the fact that I, Clara, an elderly widow whom some had written off, was still the master of my own destiny, the keeper of my own keys, and the undisputed owner of my own deed. The peace I felt was hard-won, but all the sweeter for it. The days settled into a comfortable rhythm, each one a quiet affirmation of my reclaimed life. The seasons turned, and with them, my garden transformed, a constant source of simple joy and gentle labor. I found myself looking forward to each morning, to the quiet ritual of coffee and the newspaper in my sun-drenched reading nook, surrounded by the scent of lemon balm and lavender from the pots on the windowsill. The oppressive weight of Mark and Susan's expectations and manipulations was a distant memory, like a bad dream that fades with the morning light. My life was my own again, lived on my terms, filled with small pleasures and meaningful connections. I undertook a project I'd always dreamed of, but never had the heart for while Harold was ill or the energy for during my subsequent struggles. I started writing my memoirs. Not for publication, necessarily, but for myself, for Emily, perhaps for anyone who might one day wonder about the life lived within the walls of this old house. I wrote about my childhood, about meeting Harold, about the joys and challenges of raising Mark, trying to be honest but fair, even about the painful later years. It was a cathartic process, allowing me to process decades of memories, to find patterns and meaning, and to make peace with the past, including the parts that were irrevocably broken. The house itself felt different. It was no longer just a repository of memories of Harold, though his presence was still a gentle comfort. It had become a reflection of my resilience, my taste, my enduring spirit. The cheerful yellow bathroom, the vibrant rug in the hallway, the way the sunlight fell across my desk as I wrote, these were all testaments to my quiet victory. It was a living space, vibrant and warm, filled with my energy. Occasionally, a thought of Mark and Susan would surface. I heard through the grapevine, small towns have an efficient, if sometimes embellished, communication network, that they had significantly downsized their lifestyle. Their grand plans for renovations on their own home had vanished, and there were whispers of financial strain. Susan, apparently, was not adapting well to a more modest existence. I felt a pang, not of sympathy exactly, for they had brought their troubles upon themselves, but a faint, lingering melancholy for the son I had raised, for the promise of family that had curdled into such bitter disappointment. What a waste of their energy, I thought, all that scheming and maneuvering, all that disrespect, all for nothing. They had gambled on my demise and my weakness, and they had lost spectacularly. Not just materially, but in terms of character and familial bonds. It was a quiet, almost sardonic observation I made to myself. They had been so eager to get their hands on the deed to my house, so convinced of their entitlement, that they'd completely overlooked the fact that the real treasure was never the property, but the relationships they had so carelessly destroyed. My peace was profound. It wasn't a peace born of ignorance or denial, but one earned through struggle, wisdom, and a resolute determination to honor myself and Harold's memory. It was the peace of a clear conscience, of boundaries firmly established, of a life lived authentically. Sometimes, sitting in my garden in the late afternoon, with the scent of roses heavy in the air and the old oak tree rustling its ancient secrets, I would close my eyes and just breathe. In those moments, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for Harold, for true friends like Monica and Eleanor, for the unexpected strength I'd found within myself, and for this beautiful, sturdy old house that had sheltered me, been fought for, and was now, unequivocally and forever, my home. They took my key, thinking it was the first step to claiming everything. But in the end, all they did was unlock a strength in me they never knew existed, and in doing so, they lost far more than they could ever have hoped to gain. And I, Clara, found my way back to myself, deed in hand, heart at peace. Thank you all for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, please do hit that subscribe button and maybe share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to reclaim your power.